The sun, we can see. Earth, we can see. Plants and animals, beautifully visible. Clouds, we can see. Seeing is believing, meaning not seeing is not believing. And that's the beginning of our bewilderment. This is DOCOMEDARY. For millions of years, different of generations have over the years learned to believing an imaginary line. Without argument, a line has notionally been drawn on Earth. This simply means that the equator exists only in our minds. Is it the equator's invisibility that makes it special? The most stubborn and the most controversial professor in the history of science is here to argue the history, science, and myths of the imaginary line.
As a well-traveled scholar throughout the world, I find it to be dubious and mind-boggling that a group of scientists managed to convince us that there is an imaginary line. Get the word, an imaginary line that cuts the earth into two, and they called it the equator. It's quite fascinating that the whole world can believe that there is an you can believe, because you can choose not to imagine. That is why they told us it's an imaginary line. So like last time I was going to Nanyuki, then I see a whole signpost on the road. You are now crossing the equator. So you are now crossing the imaginary line. I get out, I'm trying to look, where is this imaginary line? So what if we choose not to imagine? So I'd like to debunk, there's nothing like the equator. Somebody cannot tell you there's an imaginary line. And they got to the extent of telling us that the imaginary line is 25,000 miles. How do you measure an imaginary line?
To say that areas around the equator get more heat from the sun, yet the Earth's position is globally the same, is just as strange.
Let's speak plainly and literally. There's nothing like an imaginary line. Let's begin with the synonym. Imaginary. This means non-existent. So, in simpler terms, the equator is a non-existent line. Are you hearing yourself or are you hearing me? They convince us to believe there is a fiction. Imaginary means it's a fiction line. So this is a myth. It's even beyond a myth. Can somebody come and tell you you have an imaginary girlfriend? Like you tell me as a professor, you have an imaginary girlfriend that surrounds your home. Imaginary means invisible. So we don't have any line.
Standing at a latitude of 0 degrees, you can be in the north and south simultaneously. The Earth spins quite fast, hence, greater centrifugal force at the equator weakens, influencing the intensity of the gravitational pull. This is why rocket launch sites are usually located close to the equator. But there's an unlikelihood that you'll feel any difference unless you're a rocket scientist.
Actually, one of the professors here was telling me that the gravity is lower at the equator. So it means if you are walking, there you will walk slow because the gravity is stronger. I like to debunk this mind-blowing that we choose to believe there is no line. They even say that it crosses 13 countries. Do you know I can imagine it crosses Egypt? How can you convince me that that imaginary line goes through Kenya? Because I can also choose to imagine, because it's an imaginary line, I can choose to imagine it goes through even all the countries. So I debunk this myth. It's unreal, it's not true, and as a scientist, I think this is something we need to terminate.
Coriolis effect states that as the planet spins, air moves clockwise in southern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere.
Now, to add salt to injury, we choose to believe, that is you guys, you choose to believe that there is this equator. Now, once you believe that, they decided to add salt to the injury. And they say this equator is in between two other imaginary lines. And they even gave them the name, actually, the Tropic of Capricorn. And the other one, I don't know, is the Tropic of Cancer. So you mean, you already believe there is an imaginary line in between two other imaginary lines. Hi.
For the same gravity reason, since gravity is weak at the equator, it's easier to balance things. But the difference is so insignificant that it will still be hard to balance things.
It's not even fascinating. This is a far-fetched theory that In between an imaginary line, there are other two imaginary lines. So I don't know whether you guys are getting it. This invisible line is in between two other invisible lines. This imaginary line, I even choose, guys, just imagine. You are being told to imagine there is an imaginary line in between two other imaginary lines that cuts the earth into two. In between the professor, there are other two imaginary professors that I cannot see. I debunk. It is a dubious theory. This is a far-fetched. This is a peddler of lies. We don't have, and if you true, go stand there. For those who live in my country, go at Nanyuki, where there is, and I want you to photo yourself crossing that imaginary line. Don't send me the photo of the poster or that sign that you are now crossing. No, show me you crossing, and you tell me how gravity there when you are walking, the earth is pulling you more down. You cannot say, am I an imaginary person? No. So I would like to debunk, and as a professor, categorically, we are of this school of thought. We choose to imagine. So, are you choosing to be imaginary and to imagine there is an I don't even know what I say, because I say you are imagining that there is an imaginary line. So guys, this is dubious. This is just an imaginary line, and I choose not to imagine. And as Rene Descartes once said, laboromnia on visit, which means doubt is the beginning of knowledge, and I have doubted that there is an imaginary line. Now, I know most of you will call me a conspiracist, that I'm coming up with conspiracy, because I have chosen to imagine that there is no imaginary line. Now, let me imagine, if you believe there is an equator, an imaginary line that casts the earth into northern and southern hemisphere, then I also want to come up with my own theory, that even for flights to come from Africa to United States to everywhere around the world, I want to tell you there is an imaginary line beyond the ozone layer that is called a flyquator. This is the line that the plane follow to know where they are going. And this imaginary line is divided into very, very many routes. That's why planes can go to Africa, others can go to Europe, because it's a flyquator. It's an imaginary line of lines. And that's in my view, and I want you to believe it. If there is equator, there is flyquator, because it's also imaginary. The pilot imagine that they are imaginary line they follow.
As far as argument is concerned, I'm afraid Professor Henry might be right, unless his argument is further challenged. This is DOCOMEDARY.